Okay, good morning and welcome to this Good Friday Quiet Day presentation and meditation on the Shroud of Turin. Just a reminder, as the bishop asked, that because this is a quiet day, this is going to be pretty much a monotone presentation by me. I'm most happy to answer any questions that you may have. So as we go through, please do jot those down, and either we can discuss those tomorrow or Sunday, or even better, email those questions or comments or observations to me, and that way I can make sure that I have responded to you. And it may be something that others who are attending may find interesting as well. So please do that. I assume that most of you have heard of the Shroud of Turin or have some familiarity with it, probably have watched some TV programs. So this may be somewhat repetitious for some of you. Hopefully you'll learn a few things that you'll take away. I'm a bit of a Shroud of Turin devotee or advocate. There's no shortage, as I point out in the last page of the handout, there's no shortage of YouTube videos on the Shroud of Turin. Just put that in as a search term and you'll get so many returns. You could watch these videos for many, many days. But do that as a follow-up. If you find this interesting, do that, because there's so much good information out there on the internet right now about the Shroud. And I'll skip right back to the end because I want to point out one thing in particular. So back on the very last page of the handout, there is a section called Resources, and the very first one is called website, designated shroud.com. This is a really interesting story. We'll talk about the Shroud of Turin research project, which the shorthand for that is called STURP, S-T-U-R-P. And when the team was being formed in the late 70s, it was a team of about 33 to 35 very highly regarded scientists were forming. A man named Barry Schwartz was asked to be the official photographer for the project. And his initial response was kind of disbelief and reluctance. A, he's a Jew. B, he's a non-observant Jew. And he actually said to the person who called him to ask him to be the photographer, "Why would you want me? I'm a non-observant Jew." And the gentleman said, "Well, you might have heard that Jesus was a Jew, so maybe you would have some interesting input." And that won him over. And fast forward, I'm kind of doing a little bit of a spoiler alert here, but fast forward to about 1992 or so, I think it's in the handout. After he had participated in the Shroud of Turin research project and they had issued their findings, and years went by, he became concerned that there wasn't a central resource for disseminating information, reliable information about the Shroud. Pro or con, he had a scientist's attitude, and so he was willing to put good information or critical information out there, and he created the shroud.com website. And in the process, he was so affected by the Shroud and came to the conclusion, not so much that it's proof of Jesus' resurrection, but he is now convinced, and he says this in all of his YouTube videos, he's convinced that the Shroud is an authentic first century relic of someone who has been crucified. And that's coming a long way from somebody who thought it was ridiculous and really kind of belittled the whole notion of the Shroud and the premise underlying it. And so he's now an observant Jew. And so I think this is the impact. It helps to illustrate the impact that a careful examination and consideration of the Shroud can have on people. And as Christians who already believe, we profess our faith in the Creed every Sunday or at every service, why should it matter? It's, quote, just a relic, right? Well, in one sense, that's true. None of us believe, I'm pretty sure no one here is sitting here as Christians because we came through Christ because of our belief in the Shroud. So it's not necessary for our faith at all. But if it's genuine, if it's really the linen cloth that wrapped Jesus later today, basically, later today on Good Friday. What does that say? And what does that indicate to us about how our faith can be enriched by such a relic that it may well be, personally I believe it is, authentic? Another thing is that relics are sometimes associated with miracles. There have been very few, only one modern miracle that is maybe associated with a relic. But you'll remember when Jesus was walking down the streets of Jerusalem and the woman just wanted to touch his garment. What happened? She was healed. Her blood flow of 12 or longer years, much longer than that, was stopped by touching his garment. We learn in Acts that both when Peter passed by, just his shadow was sufficient to heal persons who were infirm. And then Paul, remember they talk if they could just touch his garment, the belt of his garment, people were healed. So there are miracles associated with relics, and I'm not suggesting that this is of that nature. And I think there are some reasons why it's probably not as associated with miracles as some other relics. But it is something that I'm suggesting deserves, if it's real, our very highest respect and veneration. And it also informs us about what exactly Jesus was going through as we speak. He was hanging on the cross until about 3 p.m. today. And this illustrates what he was going through. So with that introduction, I'm just going to go pretty much through the handout. All of these illustrations, except this large one, which was just too big to copy, and this map, I think everything else is in your handout. So I'll try to refer to these by illustration or figure number as we go through. We'll also make this handout available in PDF form. I'll email that to you all later today because the pictures just show up better on a computer screen and you can enlarge them and really study them in detail. And then on the YouTube video, we'll find a way either by embedding the link in the description box or maybe putting a notice that the PDF is available on our church's website. One way or another, people who watch this video after the fact will have the chance to see the handout as well. This, as it's indicated in the handout on the description, is a natural light picture of the shroud. Now, if you saw it today, it would not be this enhanced. People who see the shroud in person or live on TV are usually pretty disappointed. It's a lot like looking through a telescope your first time and you think Jupiter's going to be this big and Saturn's rings are going to be like this, and they're just these little dots. And so people tend to be a little disappointed by the reality of the image. But this is fairly close to what you will see in person. And I'm just going to walk around this image as sort of an introduction to then fill in the details later as we go along. But let's start with what are obviously the scourge marks in both the frontal and what's called the dorsal part of the image. And in this image, it's really kind of helpful. Whoever created this highlighted the scourge marks and the blood flow in red. And clearly you can see this was a horrific torture that this individual was put under. And interestingly, as experts have studied this, you can see that these scourge marks are angled from both sides. And this is figure number 1, by the way, from both sides. And they kind of angle downward. And they do on the lower leg as well. But experts have concluded that on the thigh area, these scourge marks, which come from both sides, go from a downward to an upward angle. And you can tell that by, unfortunately, the direction of the tear in the flesh and the direction of the blood flow. So basically on the back, you have downward scourge marks here, downward scourge marks here, upward scourge marks here from both sides. So what can you conclude from that? You had 2 executioners, or 2 floggers, and it would make sense if you're standing off to the side of this individual, scourging him on the back, the flagrum, we'll talk about that in a minute, will be coming at a downward angle. And if you're whipping him on the lower leg, again. But it would make sense to really get a good hit on those thighs to swing at a more upward angle. And so experts have concluded that this flogging involved 2 floggers standing on each side, and they can even tell from measuring the height of these wounds and the angle from which they come, they're pretty sure that they were of differing heights. So you can tell a lot from just the sort of forensic evidence of this picture. Another interesting aspect of the image is the big blotch of blood on what looks like the left side, right? And on this photo, we have that right here, okay? And again, it looks like on the left side. Well, this, of course, brings to mind immediately the spear wound that we learn about in the Gospels to determine that Jesus was actually dead when the Roman soldier speared him with a lance. But the interesting thing is, it's shown here on the left side. Well, if you're an artist faking this linen shroud, you probably wouldn't have put it on the left side because the Bible says it's on the right side, correct? So that's kind of a mystery that gets solved by a photographer named Secondo Pia in 1898. We'll talk about that in a moment. I also want to point out, you can see on your handout this L-shaped series of holes which is repeated on both sides here and more faintly further down the shroud. Those holes become important in helping us to determine whether the shroud is a fake, a medieval fake, or it's authentic, and we'll talk about those in a minute. It's hard to tell, but again, forensics examiners looking at this picture have concluded a couple things, and you can see this pretty readily in this picture. Down at the bottom, in the right hand image, the right leg is actually what looks to be on the left. That's the right leg. And if you look at the left leg, the foot is a little bit, the leg seems to be a little bit shorter, okay? And you see that down here as well, okay? Well, why would that be? Because if Jesus had been affixed to a cross in the manner that we traditionally think, look at our crucifix. It's exactly the way our crucifix shows it. The right foot underneath, flattened out, the left foot on top, nailed together with one nail, and so we see this blood flow on the bottom of the right foot, a little blood flow on the right foot over here, not as much on the left foot. But this crucifix, as it turns out, is a really good model of what we think Jesus was, how he was positioned when he was crucified. It's surprisingly accurate. But the reason why one leg looks shorter, see how the left leg is a little elevated and a little bit shorter. And then if you look down at the description and the depiction in figure 2, you can see that his legs are drawn up. And that would be because rigor mortis tends to set in about 2 to 4 hours after death and can last as long as 24 to 48 hours. So if Jesus were affixed in this position for any length of time, rigor mortis could easily have caused him to retain that position. And it does appear that if this is an authentic image of Jesus at the time of resurrection, it does appear that his left leg was slightly raised, a little bit shorter, and therefore he was still under rigor mortis. Here's another reason why they think that's the case. It's hard to tell, but on the back side, there's no sign of flattening, particularly in the buttocks area. So if you're in rigor mortis, there's not going to be flattening, whereas if you weren't, then you'd be more spread out. Just incredible little details. Something else worth pointing out preliminarily is on the knees here. And as you can see on the figure number 1, a little bit, particularly on the right leg, unusual abrasions. And also they've determined, you can see the darker discoloration along the upper back. Well, what would have caused abrasions on Jesus' upper back other than being nailed to the cross, carrying the cross, right? So it was common, we're not exactly certain, as our stations show here, Jesus is carrying the entire cross. And that's traditional to show that. But what we really believe was common, because the entire cross could have weighed as much as 300 pounds. So it was common for victims of crucifixion to carry only the crossbar called the patibulum, and they would tie that to the victim, and that's what he would carry to the location of crucifixion. Just on a personal note, for those of you who do the rosary, today are the sorrowful mysteries, and one of the mysteries is the carrying of the cross. And that one, even right now, it just gives me the whammies, because I think about when I'm walking on that rough asphalt, and you know those streets of Jerusalem must have been far more rough than our streets. And you're tied to the cross, and you go down, there's nothing to stop you. And your knees are going to get scuffed, and you're going to do a face plant in the street. And the crucifixion itself is horrific, but I can't comprehend the crucifixion, because at that time Jesus is not only impaled to the cross and going through what all humans go through, but he's also carrying the sins of the world. But I can kind of relate, because I've taken a fall on rough surfaces, how awful it must have been to just go down and know you're going down and there's nothing to stop you. Well, again, an interesting aspect of examination of the shroud is that they have taken sticky tape samples of essentially the whole shroud, and they did this back in 1978 and a little bit later too. And sticky tape samples show, both in the region of the knees and near the nose and face, fragments of limestone. More importantly, they've been able to determine that those limestone fragments are indigenous to the area around Jerusalem. That's a powerful piece of evidence relating to the authenticity of the shroud. No medieval forger could possibly have known, I need to go get a little limestone from Jerusalem and sprinkle it on the linen like fairy dust to make sure that somebody in the 21st century doesn't figure out that I forged this. Really an incredible fact. Notice here on figure 1, around the hands, 2 things, well, really 3 things. On the back of the hand, and this would actually be the left hand, we'll talk about why that seems reversed in a minute, but on the back of the hand, and it shows up even better in your photograph, the blood on the forearm seems to, from the direction when you look at it more closely, it seems to run uphill, which makes no sense. And the blood here on the wrist, again, it just makes no sense. Well, but think about if you're impaled to the cross, they've calculated that this person's arms were impaled at about a 20-degree angle above the head. And as you think about how the blood would have run down the wrist and down along the forearm, it makes perfect sense that this is accurately showing the actual blood flow of this victim of crucifixion. Another interesting thing about the hands, all you see are 4 fingers and no thumbs. Well, I'm getting ahead of myself, but that's all right. A major reason why they think that's the case is, let's go ahead and turn back to the 3rd page and look at figure number 6. Here's a close-up of this section of the shroud, and you can see the blood flow and how along the forearms also it tends to run uphill. But the important thing is here, look where the nail is impaled. Romans were experts, if nothing else, they were experts in crucifixion. They did thousands of them. And they knew how to keep people on the cross. And the traditional way, of course, of showing a crucifixion is palms, crosses, or nails in the palms. Well, you'd tear out pretty quickly. And so they've determined that more likely than not, the nail was impaled between these small bones and what we call the wrist. Now, in first century Greek and Hebrew usage, hands and wrists were considered one unit. So when Jesus says, "Look at my hands," or somebody else said, and they're really talking about this area right here, that's still they think of as the hand. And so even with the placement of the nail here in what we think of more as a wrist, that would be in Jesus' hands, and it would keep him securely affixed to the cross throughout the entire period. Well, again, look at our crucifix. You can't really tell it too well, but whoever designed this was either had used the shroud as a model or was really just up to speed on Roman crucifixion, because of the nails in the crucifix up above the altar show it very well where those nails would have gone in an actual crucifixion. I've mentioned the limestone. Also from these sticky tape samples, experts in pollen fossils, how do you get that job, have determined that around the nose, around the cheekbone, and around the knees, I've mentioned the limestone, but particularly up around the face, there are fossils of pollen that are indigenous to, again, the area around Jerusalem. Again, how would a forger have known to do that? And more interestingly is the fact that they found some pollen fossils from a very specific species of thorn bush that researchers believe would very likely have been used as a crown, what we call a crown of thorns. And that bush typically blooms about this time of the year in Israel. And so again, here you have this fabulous little factoid that lends such credibility to the authenticity of the shroud. As far as the wounds on the head go, of course these would be associated with the blood flow from the scalp, and if you've ever cut your scalp, you know it bleeds like crazy, right? It's hard to sometimes get a scalp cut to stop. And right here, and you can see this in yours, it even shows up better on the left-hand side of figure number 1. It looks like a backwards 3, and that's a blood flow that would have kind of followed the channel of the brow at the time. But really, you see the blood more on the back side than you do on the front, which again lends authenticity to whoever this person was impaled with very sharp objects on his head. A lot of researchers believe, and this bears out from the wounds that we see, that the crown of thorns was really more of a cap of thorns. And so it was made not only in this circular kind of halo style, but it had pieces that went over the top. And that kind of makes sense to kind of keep it all together, and then you could just go right like that. And so that would explain the profusion of the blood, particularly on the backside. Right here in the lower back, we see blood extending out from basically the small of the back or the loins. What that would indicate is that the blood that came from this wound post-mortem continued to flow out after the man was placed in the shroud, and this makes sense, that he was rolled from side to side as those who were preparing the body were preparing him. So the blood would have flowed both directions from that spot. Again, just another important little detail that lends credence to the authenticity. I think that's all I wanted to do from a perspective of an introduction. So let's turn to page 2 and look at figure number 3. Oh, by the way, back on figure number 2, I've quoted a couple passages of script, one passage of scripture. We know from the gospel accounts that Joseph bought some linen cloth, took the body down, wrapped it in the linen, placed it in a tomb cut out of the rock. And we know that Joseph of Arimathea was a rich man, not to mention a member of the Sanhedrin. So he probably would have bought the very fine linen. He had already had a tomb cut out for himself that was unused, and so he's not going to wrap himself in cheap cut-rate linen. He probably would have accessed the best he could. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But again, Nicodemus, remember Nicodemus is the one who came to Jesus by night because he was afraid of what people might say if they saw him with Jesus. Well, here at least he shows his true colors. He bought about 75 pounds of myrrh and aloes to help Joseph prepare the body for burial. So he did find a little bit of courage at that point. So figure number 3 on page 2. This is I know you know, probably have heard this story, but it's worth going through again. This is as good as it got for centuries. And it wasn't even this good, as I've mentioned. The image is fainter than this. But until 1898, when a sort of very avid amateur, but really more professional, I guess, I think he ended up starting a studio, photographer, got the opportunity to photograph the shroud in anticipation of an exposition of the shroud. Up until this point, the shroud was treated, it was venerated, it was regarded as a holy object, but the scientific method wasn't exactly what they were worried about at that time, and so for centuries this shroud was hauled out and hung out in the open and treated with no regard for scientific preservation. But this was the first time that anybody was ever given the opportunity to photograph the shroud. And Secondo Pia, I'm going to say he was about this far away from the back wall from the shroud because his camera was one of these huge still cameras that you put the hood over your head, and he had to take a very long time exposure, and this was under very difficult conditions. He was only given a short amount of time to do this at night before or between the actual expositions of the shroud. He took the picture, he went back, he developed the picture, and this is what he got. And that's what has really kind of turned the world upside down about the shroud ever since, because, as it turns out, the shroud itself is a photographic negative on non-photographically sensitive linen. This is a negative. When you develop the negative, what you get is a positive picture. There's no forger in any century that could have thought of that. And so it makes you question entirely what's going on here. So, what we have here, if the shroud is authentic, is as close to an actual picture of Jesus as you could possibly ever have. And that has always just sent chills up my spine. And I've quoted from 1 Corinthians in the famous chapter 13, remember, where Paul says, "Now we see through a glass darkly, but then face to face." And I think this is seeing through the glass darkly. To be privileged to be able to see an actual picture of Jesus really just kind of boggles the mind. And for centuries, this was sort of hidden information in the shroud. And here we are, privileged in the 21st century to see this. And you wonder about God's. Did he get a little bit of a chuckle out of this? All these centuries, this has been preserved so that with today's technology, we could actually see this image. So things to notice about this image are, and they're hard to see, but when you blow it up, you can see it a lot better. There's clearly swelling on the cheekbones. Forensic examiners believe with pretty high degree of certainty that the nose is broken. Remember, if he falls while carrying the cross. Even, see this dark spot here is believed to be where they plucked out part of his beard. And we learn about that in Scripture, that he was beaten about the face, that they plucked out his beard, and they put the crown or cap of thorns on him. I didn't include this in the handout because, frankly, I'm not convinced But a lot of people are, and the books that I'll point out to you here in a minute mention that if in high definition photographs you can make out Roman coins, and more importantly, you can make out Roman coins that were minted by Pilate in about 28 AD. And it would be common for, under Jewish practices, to put coins on the eyes to keep them shut, particularly during rigor mortis, to keep them from coming open and staying open. And so you can research this yourself and see what you think. I'm not saying they aren't there. I just can't see that except with some really super duper image photoshopping, but a lot of people are convinced that's there. This little line down here becomes important in later centuries, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Let's talk briefly about the blood flow. This would be figure number 4 down here. This has been tested to be human blood, and you can't see it. This little, you can see in this picture this sort of triangular, that's not blood flow, that's water that was left over from putting the shroud, keeping it from burning. That's just a water stain. But more down along, as extending to the lower right, in higher magnification, you can see what clearly was serum. And so if you look at the picture of, in figure number 5, when they came to Jesus, the soldier pierced him with a spear, and between the 5th and 6th rib, which is going to be right in here. And what would have happened to someone who had been dead for a period of time during the stress and trauma of being crucified, you not only lose a tremendous amount of blood and sweat and fluid, but a lot of that collects in the pleural and the thoracic cavity. And so when John testified that when Jesus was speared, blood flowed out and water, that's entirely consistent with spearing a dead person, because the red blood cells would have sedimented to the bottom, and then the clearer serous fluid would have flowed out next. And it's even, the order is correct in the scripture of quoted in figure 5, bringing a sudden flow of blood and water. He even has the order correct. Just truly amazing. And here's what's really interesting about this scripture. The man who saw it has given testimony, and his testimony is true. He knows that he tells the truth, and he testifies so that you may also believe. 4 times he tells you, I saw what I saw, and you better believe it. And here we have evidence on the shroud that what he said was exactly right. Surprise, surprise. So going back to the one thing I've not filled in, because this is a negative, everything's reversed on this image. So what looks to be the left is the right, and vice versa. And that again makes perfect sense. If it's a photographic negative, everything's reversed. Moving to the next page, I think we've pretty much talked about figure number 6 relative to the hands. Just note that on page 7, or figure 7 on this page, where the feet are shown, again, how well it matches the crucifix up front, and how the placement of the nails would have been such that they would have been sufficiently or adequately placed to keep the person from tearing away from the cross in the lower body, in between the 2nd and 3rd toes. I'm not sure I mentioned, but in both cases, not only would this be painful just objectively, but particularly with respect to the wrists, where this nail goes is either on or extremely close to what's called the median nerve, and that would have caused excruciating pain just the whole time he was impaled on the cross. But particularly on the feet, the placement of the nerves was such that the only way you could breathe when you were impaled on the cross would be to push up with your feet and then let down, so you could sort of artificially create sort of like an iron lung, where the pressure is reduced and you breathe in air and then it's increased and it forces air out. You're kind of creating your own little iron lung because you can't breathe normally. And so every single movement would have been excruciating to draw a breath. Remember, Christ only said, when we talk about the 7 last words, he doesn't say a lot because it would have been so hard to speak at that time and so painful to speak. Also, on the back, remember the scourge is back here. If you're impaled on the back of that stipes, the upright part, every time you breathe, every time you adjust yourself, you're reopening, scraping, and irritating those wounds that you already had. This would be a good time to talk about why Jesus died so quickly on the cross. Remember, the soldiers and Pilate were so surprised that he died that quickly. Well, look at how badly he was scourged. He hadn't eaten much of anything since the night before. In the Garden of Gethsemane, he sweat blood, probably lost a lot more sweat. He was beaten by the soldiers. He was hopelessly, mercifully scourged. So by the time the crossbar is tied to him, he's almost dead. Now the Romans knew how far they could take it, and they would beat you kind of within an inch of your life. It does appear that Christ got more of a beating than you would ordinarily expect. Sometimes the Romans wanted you to live a long time, and so they wouldn't even nail you to the cross. They'd just tie you to the cross. Or they'd give you a little footrest. You've all seen crucifixes where there's a little footrest for the victim. Sometimes there'd be even a short bench to sit on. So that was why, if they wanted to really prolong your agony, that they would do that. But by the time Jesus was affixed to the cross, he was certainly near death to begin with. He'd probably lost a huge volume of blood and fluid. And we don't know exactly what caused Christ's death from a medical perspective, but the consensus seems to be that he went into hypovolemic shock. Hypovolemic shock happens when you lose 20% or more of your blood and fluids. Your heart can no longer get an adequate supply to your body, and you die. And as a sidebar, this is a good time to mention, I've sent this around in previous emails on previous years. If you've had a chance to listen to it, great. If you haven't, I can't recommend a better thing for you to do today, tomorrow, than to go to this website or this YouTube video called On the Physical Death of Jesus Christ, an article published by the Journal of the American Medical Association. So this is peer-reviewed, I think from the 1980s. And this YouTube is a condensation of the actual article. It is about 18 minutes, but it's just a tremendous introduction to all that led up to Jesus' crucifixion, from the Garden of Gethsemane up through his death, as well as common Roman crucifixion practices. I really, really recommend that you listen to that YouTube video. And when I send you the PDF, you can just click on the link and go listen to that. I'm going to pass this around for you to glance at. This is the actual article. It's a little longer than the video, but it'll give you a sense of how professionally done this analysis was and how credible it is. So I'll just pass that around. How are we doing on time? Okay, I think we're doing okay, because I've covered quite a bit of this. So this is kind of what you can tell from the shroud, even before the Stirp team in 1978 took a really close look at it. All of this is sort of inferred from that pre-Stirp, except the pollen and the limestone examination. But in 1978, or 1976, an officer at the United States Air Force Academy and another scientist used a NASA-developed machine called the VP8 Analog Image Analyzer, and they thought, well, let's run a picture of the shroud through and see what happens. What happened is, this is not the best printing job here, but what happened, much to their utter amazement, they found that this 2D image had 3D information built into it. This was a real shocker. From before, since, and after, no other 2D image in history has ever replicated this phenomenon. They've tried and tried and tried. No artist can build 3D information into a 2D image. The reason that this is here is that if you think about the shroud, go back to that figure number 2, lying on the face and on the body, there would be different distances between the body. Sometimes the shroud's touching, sometimes it's inches away. What the image analyzer, which was developed for really planetary, I think planetary sciences, lunar image analysis and planetary analysis, the VP8 image analyzer is essentially a density analyzer. It analyzes the density of the image. And the correlation, there is a correlation between, in distance, the closer the object is to the overlay, the more intense that image would be. And so what this analyzer recreates is essentially a 3D image, because it could tell the differences of density in the image. And nobody challenges this. This is not something you have to leap out on faith about. This is something that was so credible, so convincing, it led to the formation of the STURP team, which got together in Italy in 1978 to examine the shroud. Very quickly, 2 images of real importance here are the blood on from the area of the lower back. You can clearly see coagulation and capillary flow, and just as you might expect from somebody who had bled on a piece of linen. Unlike the image itself, which is so faint, this image only penetrates each of the surface fibers 1/10 of the diameter of the fiber. And each of these linen fibers is less than a human hair. So the image is no deeper than 1/10 of a linen fiber. It's incredibly thin. And the STURP team concluded, and all scientists agree since then, this isn't paint, this isn't scorching, this isn't vapor. There's no known way to create this image, other than the best that physicists have come up with is that it would require a super brilliant flash of ultraviolet light on the order of many billions of watts for no more than 1/40 of a second. Well, I'm pretty sure no medieval forger had access to that kind of UV light. In fact, the amount of UV light to create just this for a 40/10 of a second exceeds the entire sum of all UV light sources in the world, including all of our high-powered lasers. There just isn't enough power in the world to create this image. So, just amazing. The linen itself, as I mentioned, Joseph would have probably purchased fine linen, and he did. For the standards of the day, this was fine linen. But today it's kind of crude, and so it's all relative. But you can see it's a herringbone weave pattern and what's called a 3-to-1 pattern. What's interesting about this linen is not only would it have been considered fine linen in the 1st century Jerusalem, nobody made it after 410 AD. So no forger would have had access to this type of linen. That's quite interesting. You can see the persistence of the redness. This has kind of got a green tint to it. Here's more red blood. You can see it here. Well, most blood, as you know, dries brown or some dark color. Everyone was surprised by the redness of the blood until they tested it and found very high levels of bilirubin. And bilirubin is often, if not always present, in victims of trauma or torture. And often their blood will stay red because of the presence of bilirubin. So the shroud has a very mysterious history. that this is a whole other presentation that I won't go into, but how do you get from 1st century to Turin, Italy? Very convincingly, there is evidence that the shroud was well known all through these years. 2 very quick examples. This icon is called the Christ Pantocrator, or Pantocrator, I don't know which is right. We know it was painted in around 550 AD. It is currently in the monastery of St. Catherine on the traditional Mount of Sinai in an Orthodox monastery, and it's been very carefully studied, and I'll just summarize. And you can see the asymmetry on the left versus the right, and this matches the mustache. Basically, forensic analysts have looked at this, and I think they identified 150 points of congruence between these 2 images. Normally 40 to 50 is what's required to establish forensically that 2 images are of the same person. So very convincing evidence that this was based on someone who had access to the shroud. Similarly, in 692, the emperor, what's his name? Justinian II, called a council. And one of the things that this council, it was a council of church leaders, but it wasn't an ecumenical council, but they did issue canons. One of the canons that they issued was that we no longer have to depict Christ as just a lamb. It's okay to depict him as a human being. And what is believed is that they had access to the shroud. And the reason they believe that is that, again, this coin, which was minted by Justinian, has such incredible similarity to the shroud image. You have this little, what looks like a lock of hair, but could well be this blood flow, the little dark spot on the beard here, the overall appearance of the face, the bright, kind of hollow-looking eyes, and the hair completely covering the ears, all add up to somebody had access to the shroud. And I mentioned in the handout that, again, Fanti and Malfi conducted an evaluation of this coin and concluded there's a 99.99% certainty that this was based on someone who had access to an image of the shroud. This is all important because the carbon dating in 1988 concluded that, and now I'm looking back at page, or the figure 16, concluded that, well, this shroud's really only from 1260 to 1390. That was really a disappointment to the shroud researchers. That took a lot of wind out of everybody's sails who believed in the authenticity of the shroud. And really for a long time, there was a lot of doubt about the authenticity of the shroud. However, 2 amateur sleuths come along, and it's a monk and a sort of amateur scientist female started to correspond, and the more they looked at the shroud sample and where they were taken, they became convinced that something was wrong with these samples. And you can see in figure number 16, number 3 is where the shroud samples were taken. And they're right on the borderline of what's believed to be authentic shroud linen and repairs that were done by the sisters of the Poor Clares, a group of sisters, after the shroud was damaged in a fire in the Middle Ages. And they found that there was a high likelihood of contamination between the cotton. Cotton was not used in the production of linen ever, but certainly not in the 1st century. So why would there be cotton fibers in the test samples that were sent? One of those samples, by the way, was sent to a lab at the University of Arizona. So they asked a man who was on the original STURP team, Ray Rogers, to look at their findings. And he was, to say the least, a grump. And he was really kind of offended that they would ask him to do this. But he reluctantly did it, and he studied these samples and the microscopic images for quite some time. And much to his great reluctance, but to his scientific credibility, he concluded that these samples were unreliable for dating purposes because he found a couple things that were really important: cotton fibers in the samples, and he also found evidence of dye in the samples. Well, what happened is when the poor Claire's repaired the shroud, they very likely dyed it to try to match the color of the shroud. So he concluded not only that the samples were unreliable, but he did his own tests called vanillin tests and compressibility tests. And he concluded the age of the shroud to be somewhere in a window of about 2,300 years, 300 years AD to 2,000 years BC, a window of time very well within where we believe the shroud would have been created in the first century. So that was in about 2005 before he died of cancer. And ever since, everyone pretty much agrees that this shroud needs to be dated again by radiocarbon dating. The problem is twofold. In 2002, for whatever reason, the Vatican, with the blessing of Pope John Paul II, said they could do sort of a spring cleaning of the shroud. And so they literally took a vacuum cleaner and vacuumed the shroud and cleaned it up and tore out these patches. We haven't even talked about the patches, but they have nothing to do with the image. They're from a fire. And redid the patches, basically really messed around with the shroud. And all of this archaeological data that was residing on the shroud was vacuumed. Now they did supposedly carefully bottle it and label where it came from and all of that, but researchers and shroud archaeologists were and remain horrified that this happened. So it may not be possible ever to do an accurate carbon dating again because of the way it's been handled. And more importantly, the problem is to get a pristine portion of the shroud, you'd almost have to get so close to the image that you're actually destroying the image itself. And there's no appetite for doing that. So the whole issue of redoing the dating has languished for quite some time. But balance all of that with all the other information that builds and builds and builds and builds and builds, and pretty soon you have pretty much an overwhelming case. And I think, in my mind, if I'm a juror, I don't have any reasonable doubt. The carbon dating's problematic, but when you look at the blood and the linen and all of these other factors, the pollen, the limestone, you can't explain that away at all. And so lastly, on the final page, I've quoted, this is back in 1981, the STURP team said, "We can conclude for now that the shroud image is that of a real human form of a scourged, crucified man. It is not the product of an artist. The bloodstains are composed of hemoglobin and also give a positive test for serum albumin. The image is an ongoing mystery, and until further chemical studies are made, the problem remains unsolved." And I've listed several reasons in summary why I think you could reasonably conclude the shroud is authentic. Very quickly, this here is the Sudarium of Oviedo. The shroud and the Sudarium have very tightly connected histories, but the good thing about the Sudarium of Oviedo is it has a very, very, very well-documented history since about 600 in Spain. We know it's been there at least that long. It's believed to be the head covering that was on Jesus' head. And three things about this which lend credibility both to it and to the shroud. It has the same limestone particles. It has the same pollen fossils as the shroud. And again, people who have recreated how this would be blood flow from the nostrils, which would have occurred from somebody terribly tortured, but like a crucifixion victim. You can see on these many YouTubes overlays of how this would have been affixed over the face of Jesus. And originally, you couldn't have gotten it all the way around because he's still on the cross. So you could only wrap it around partially. And they've even concluded that the person's head was tilted 70 degrees to the right and 25 degrees down. Look at the crucifix. And then the stains were deposited in 3 phases. Initially, just getting them off the cross, you wrap it around further, and then in the tomb. And so they can even discern 3 different phases of blood deposition, which matches particularly well with what we think would have happened to Jesus in the tomb. I think that's enough for now. Here's a picture of one of the fossils that we believe is from the time of Jesus from the Jerusalem area. The flagrum, I hadn't talked about that much, but we know that they didn't use these long whips like we think about bull whips. They used short flagrums used often. They would have used bone, whatever they could that would inflict terrible stress and pain. But real common were these sort of dumbbell shaped using 2 lead weights, could do incredible damage. I've seen them demonstrated, and it makes you really afraid. But these match up extremely well with close-ups of the scourge marks on the back of Christ. There are dumbbell-shaped marks. What forger in the Middle Ages would have known to do that? So that concludes. I hope you found that interesting. And let me point out, I'm going to leave these out on a table outdoors. A lot of my information came from a book called The Shroud, a Guide. I've picked up several copies of these. If you'd like to take one home, please do. Just let me know you've done it so I can find you if you don't return it. This center, the Turin Shroud Center of Colorado, in 2017 put out a fabulous book. Very scientific examination of the shroud that divides all of these facts into like category 1, category 2, category 3 as to reliability. Highly recommend you go to their website, which is in the handout. Highly recommend that you get a copy of this book if you want to really do your shroud research. And then finally, 2 books that I found particularly interesting. This is an old book that I found in Goodwill. This is by a man who, in the 60s, examined what we knew about the shroud up to that point. This has a really fascinating sort of whodunit account of the original persons who photographed the shroud and what conclusions were drawn from it, which remain accurate today. And then one of the more common, popular modern books, The Truth About the Shroud of Turin. Again, another great overview. And it's 2010, but its science is still quite valid. So if any of you would like to borrow those, please do. Let's close with prayer. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. Amen. Almighty God, who has given thine only Son to be unto us both a sacrifice for sin and also an example of godly life, give us grace that we may always most thankfully receive that, his inestimable benefit, and also daily endeavor ourselves to follow the blessed steps of thy Son, our Savior, Jesus Christ. Amen.